Okay, yes, so I'm Chris, and I'm going to be talking today about track and vertex finding for the CMS level 1 trigger. The most natural place to start with all this is, of course, what the CMS level 1 trigger is. So, as I guess everyone does know, hopefully, that CMS is one of the general purpose detectors at the LHC. At the LHC, we have a 40 megahertz bunch crossing rate, but obviously we can't store all that data. So we need to do some sort of event selection based on the physics potential of those events. And the way that CMS does this currently, so for now in run 3, we have a 2-stage trigger. The first stage is this level 1 hardware-based trigger. And so this does very quick and dirty partial event reconstruction. We have 100 kilohertz output, and it does all of this about 4 microseconds per event. Because it's quite quick, we have to use just the calorimeter and muon data. So we don't use any of the tracker data at all because we just don't have time to get through all of that data. The second stage does a full event reconstruction, the high-level trigger. This is all done in a server farm off on the surface. And this does a full event reconstruction. And it has about a kilohertz output. And so this is what we do currently. But as I guess everyone also knows, that we're going to be looking at the high luminosity LHC at the end of the decade. And by the end of its runtime, we're looking at sort of 3,000 inverse pentabarms of data. And this is great for our rare physics searches and precision measurements. Hopefully we can sort of dig into some tantalizing hints of new physics. And to make this all possible, we'll see this increased number of proton-proton interactions per bunch crossing, or pileup. And this very high pileup, which for sort of the ultimate high Lumi, we'll be looking at sort of a pileup of 200, which is sort of 7 or 8 times greater than we currently have. This is terrible for our current era triggering. So if we were to keep a current level 1 trigger in CMS for the high Lumi LHC, our rate will be about 4 megahertz. And so this is just impossible for us to maintain. So if we want to maintain our current physics sensitivity, we need to either, we basically just need to have a new trigger. And to make this possible, we'll be using tracker tracks within the trigger for the first time as well in this hardware level trigger. So all of this is sort of part of the overall CMS phase 2 upgrade. So this is the upgrade for the high Lumi. And you'll see sort of extensive upgrades for all parts of the detector. I'll only sort of focus on the level 1 trigger because that's kind of relevant. And this has all been moved onto an all FPGA based trigger. Our overall rate is going to go up to 750 kilohertz, and our latency is going to go up by about 3 times to 12.5 microseconds. And this is great because it means we have far more scope for more complicated algorithms. Also, part of this upgrade is a completely new tracker. So we'll see the inner tracker, which is this little bit here, going up to sort of 3.8 ETA coverage. And then this outer tracker has also been upgraded to be able for us to use that part of the outer tracker for tracker tracks within the level 1 trigger as well. And so we've seen the full 40 megahertz readout and track reconstruction with that outer tracker. All this track finding and level 1 trigger will be implemented in Xilinx FPGAs. And so I'll constantly talk about latency and resource usage for all of our algorithms, because that is kind of the point when you're looking at FPGAs. Is you have to make your algorithms very fast, and you care very much about how much of your chips you use. So this is just kind of a schematic of one of our FPGAs, and you can see that it's just full of algorithms. So we need to be really careful when we design our algorithms to fit on these kind of chips. So we have these tracks in our trigger. What can we actually do with them, and why does it mean that we can continue to maintain our physics rates? So one of the most basic things we can do is using them in our muon trigger. So we can do track matching and tracker track matching in the muon trigger to make our lepton isolation for muons better. Within our global track trigger, which does sort of event reconstruction at sort of a global level with trackers, with tracker tracks, this consists of do track-based missing ET and track-based jet finding. And this can be used in our global trigger to compare to our correlator, our calorimeter data. And one of the more important things that I will sort of discuss quite in depth is this primary vertex finding. And this is really good is because we can associate objects to this vertex. And so our prime vertex being our sort of a hard scatter in our event, so most likely to have the interesting physics that we want to trigger on. If we can associate tracks and other objects to it, we'll be able to have cleaner energy sums when we do our sort of calorimeter energy reconstruction. We'll have better lepton isolations for some electrons and taux. And it also means that we can do sort of more complicated algorithms with the reduced inputs from this associated track. And so it's really important that we reconstruct this prime vertex with a very high efficiency when looking at sort of more complicated algorithms that we want to do within our trigger. So the structure is the rest of the talk. I'll talk a bit about the tracker inputs and how we make it all possible. I'll talk about our track finding algorithm and a couple of stages of doing that. And then I'll sort of go into sort of vertex finding and how we sort of look to do that, and then some sort of improvements to that as well. So starting with the track finder inputs. As I said before, we're only using the outer tracker, and so this is this kind of region here, so the blue and red modules here. And you can see that it sort of extends all the way up to sort of 30 centimeters in Z0, and with an ETA coverage about 2.4. So we're looking to do online track finding for this ETA of 2.4. But even with just the outer tracker, which is sort of a reduction in data rates compared to the full tracker, the combinatorics for just the outer tracker is far too large for us to do that and just use it as is. So we've had to be quite clever in the way that we designed our outer tracker and outer tracker modules to make online track finding possible. And so one of the things we do for this is this idea of a PT module. And so the actual tracker modules themselves, the bits that do the detection, they consist of these two closely spaced layers of silicon. And so as a particle passes through, if we see two hits in this module that are close together, we know that its PT is relatively large. But if we see this big bend and we see these two hits far apart from each other, we know that the bend is quite large, and so the PT is relatively low. And so we can make a tunable on-detector PT cut on those tracks, even before they've been streamed to the trigger itself. And this sees sort of a 10 to 20 times reduction in data, and this actually makes our track finding possible in this online system. And sort of just to throw some numbers at you, you're going to be looking at sort of 15,000 stubs per bunch crossing at 40 megahertz, so that's a lot of data going through this trigger. And we look to reconstruct about 200 tracks with a PT greater than 2 GB per crossing. We have about 4 microseconds to do it, so not very long at all. And so to make some of this possible, we sort of exploit various bits of parallelism, regional division within the detector itself, but we'll still be looking at sort of 162 of these kind of boards, which both host 2 FPGAs to do our track finding itself. And so it's a big task, and there's a lot of sort of work done into the firmware development to make this actually possible. In terms of the actual algorithm itself, it's broken up into 2 main areas. So the first one is this track row search, which does sort of the forming of the track candidates. We then do a track fit with a Kalman filter, and then I'll talk a bit about sort of track quality, so caring about the quality of fit and what we can do with that as well. In terms of this track row search, it's relatively simple to explain. What we do is we have, this is a sort of a cross section of our outer tracker. We look for sort of 2 stubs or sort of hits in the detector in adjacent layers. We then sort of propagate a track candidate based on those 2 hits in the detector. And then what we can do is you can associate other hits in the detector to that track candidate. And this even with the sort of this huge combinatorics of 15,000 hits in the detector, we can't consider sort of every single possible hit. So we do this sort of splitting of every tracker region into further sort of inner and outer slices. And so we look only for the stubs that are compatible with both of those sort of inner and outer slices. And this manages to reduce our data rate down significantly when we're trying to do this sort of track road search part of this algorithm. Another thing to mention is that when we look at these sort of tracklet seeds, we have sort of 8 different combinations of these seeds. So it could be sort of the first 2 inner layers, it could be sort of the second 2, or it could look at the end cap layers and things like that. And we have sort of 8 different combinations that allow us to have an overall good ETA efficiency across ETA, but it also means that our latency and resource budget are sort of under control. So if we have sort of hundreds of different combinations, our resource budget would go out, it would be enormous, and so we couldn't really do that. So at every point in this, we have to care about how fast we make it do it and how small is the algorithm overall on our physical hardware. The second part of our algorithm is this track fit, so the Kalman filter. I won't go into the details because it's a bit useless. So we start with the track candidate that we've generated from the previous stage, and then we iteratively add the associated stubs that we also associated in the previous stage, and we update our track parameters to fit as we go. This Kalman filter is completely written for FPGA, so it's actually in VHDL, and it does its entire fit within about 1 microsecond. So it's a very lightweight Kalman filter that does this entire fit incredibly quickly. We then have this sort of final step that does the packing up of our tracking to 96 bits to be sped out to various parts of the detector after that. And I'll just show you a couple of sort of performance parts of the track fit itself. So this becomes relevant when I talk about vertex binding. So carrying out the Z0 resolution, you see that it's a strong dependence on ETA. So you see you've got about centimeter resolution at very high ETAs, but about sort of 0.1 to 0.2 centimeter resolution at very low ETA. And so this sort of kind of really motivates how we do our primary vertex finding a bit later. And I also include sort of the overall track finding efficiency across ETA. So you can see that we're relatively good. So sort of looking at 95% track finding efficiency for tracks above 2 GB. We see slight dips in sort of various regions, and this tends to be because we have a transition between our barrel and end caps. But overall, the track finding efficiency is kind of flat across theta, which is good and what we're sort of aiming for. So we have this track fit, but what do we actually? One of the sort of the outputs of this track fit is going to be tracks that don't necessarily originate from primary sort of actual tracking particles. And so you can see that your natural path to your track finding is you could find sort of tracks like this. So finding tracks out of these sort of hits in the detector, but you could also find tracks like this, which sort of use two genuine hits in the detector from actual particles, but fit a completely fake track within our PT window. And so we want to have some sort of control on these because these tend to be quite, well, they're sort of high PT tracks that we don't necessarily want to keep. And you can see that what we see is that at high PTs, a sort of genuine, a large percentage of our tracks, about 10% of our tracks, don't actually originate from real particles. And so when we pass them downstream, this is obviously quite a big issue because a lot of our downstream algorithms are very sort of PT focused. And so we care a lot about the momentum of our particles when we're doing our triggering. And so we need to do something to try and reduce the impact of, or to try and reduce the number of these fake tracks being passed downstream. One of the most simple things we can do is look at the track fit itself. So one of the outputs of the Kalman filter is our chi-squared values, so how good the fit is in various dimensions. And we can do sort of very basic cuts on these to try and reduce the number of fakes. And so this plot here just shows you a track-based missing ET measurement. And so you can see that our turn-on curve for no cuts at all on any of the fakes is relatively, you get sort of high efficiency of about 600 GV, whereas if you put the cuts on your fakes, you can reduce that down to about 300 GV. So it's really important that we try and reduce down the overall number of fakes that have been passed on downstream, because these kind of algorithms do care a lot about them. And so you can see here is that we have this kind of effectively a binary classification problem that uses lots of different cuts on different variables. And while we could just try and look at those cuts individually and try and optimize them for a various working point, what we could also do is just pass it to some sort of machine learning algorithm that does an overall training on that binary classification on the various different track features. And so this is what we've done going forwards, is we have a business decision tree that's trained on several sort of helix parameters of the track itself, and then other sort of quality variables, so the chi-square values and things like that. This is a very lightweight BDT. Anyone in sort of BDTs will know that a depth of 3 with 60 iterations is tiny, but we do see very good performance with it. So just looking at this plot here, we see that in green is our sort of our nominal sort of chi-square cuts that I showed before, but in purple is our BDT, and you can see that we outperform the chi-square cuts sort of across the threshold range of BDT. We're able to maintain a high track finding efficiency with a low fake rate, which is really good. One of the nice things about this is we can also pass down sort of a probability of a track being fake rather than just a single value to our downstream algorithms. And so they can make their own cuts and choose a working point for their own specific algorithms, which is a lot more flexible going downstream. In terms of this algorithm going into firmware, because we do need to make it fit, it does its overall inference with about 33 nanoseconds, so incredibly fast. And it takes up a tiny fraction of our FPGA. So this is a very viable usage of our resources when sort of considering what we can do with the available resources we have. So I've spoken a lot about track finding. So what do we actually do with the tracks and what can we do with the tracks? So I'll talk I'll talk very sort of in depth about primary vertex finding. And this all sort of begins, as I've just said, the track finding itself. So you're looking at sort of hundreds of tracks per event with a PT greater than 2 GV. And this plot here just sort of shows you the distribution of tracks in Z0. So we have this sort of window of about 30 centimeters that we care about. And this is all of our tracks sort of distributed along this line. With in gray, you see the PT. So you can see the sort of these clusters of high PT regions, and they sort of all correspond to individual sort of protein-protein interactions. So the first thing we can do when we have sort of this set of tracks is the track quality, as said before. So sort of in baseline, we just look at the chi-square parameters. We can do very sort of simple cuts on that just to try and reduce the down. The next thing we do is the vertex finding itself. I'll go into a lot more detail in this, but sort of very briefly, what it does is it histograms all our tracks in Z0 and looks for basically this peak in PT. So we look for the 3 consecutive bins within this histogram with the highest PT. So you can see in this case, we've done a really good job of reconstructing our vertex. We had this really high PT peak. And you can see that we're very close. So our reconstruction and true vertex are basically on top of each other, because we'd be able to sort of isolate that high PT peak. Once we've done that, we do some sort of track to vertex association. So we don't want to pass down a vertex, we want to pass down what's associated to the vertex to do the physics on it. And there's a couple of ways we can do that. Very simply, we can just do a sort of a 1 centimeter look. So say any tracks within a centimeter of our vertex, they're associated. Or we can do sort of something a bit more clever. So I showed you that plot of Z0 resolution as a function of eta. If we cut on 1 centimeter, we lose every track that has a high eta because their resolution is a lot degraded at that high eta. So we have basically sets of bins that we allow sort of different thresholds to be allowed for. So at this high eta, we have a sort of a 2 centimeter window to associate our tracks to the vertex. And this gives us far better efficiency when passing down these downstream objects. And so once we have these associated objects, we can then do some sort of downstream algorithm with them. But I won't sort of go into the details on that. For the vertex finding concept itself, so this is the algorithm we use. We take some tracks, we weight them by their PT and put them in this histogram along Z0. We run this sort of 3-bin convolution. So to find the 3 consecutive bins, we run a 1-1-1 1D convolution across that histogram. We then do sort of some sort of peak finding to try and find the bin with the highest PT, or sort of the highest weighted weight in the histogram. And then we have some sort of Z0 window to associate our track to our vertex. And these plots here just show you kind of the vertex finding performance for our baseline approach. So you can see that in this sort of core of the residual, we're dominated by our Z0 resolution of our tracks, which kind of makes a lot of sense. But in the tails, we do see quite long tails going sort of all the way out to sort of -15 and 15 centimeters. And the reason for this is that we have these sort of high PT fake clusters that appear in along our distribution. And these high PT fakes appear like sort of fake vertices. And so we need some way of sort of reducing that down. So all of this I've shown sort of within the track finding itself. There's a lot of other features that we care about when looking at our tracks. And so things like looking at the eta, which sort of dominates our sort of Z0 resolution. I've also shown that track quality is quite important as well. So we have this output of a BDT that is sort of useful to look at when trying to cut down sort of various features within our tracks. And so there's sort of this non sort of obvious function of sort of various different variables that we want to use when doing sort of a sort of process like this when looking at our tracks. And where we could sort of painstakingly decide what function to use based on various different features, we could use a sort of a generic function generator and use a sort of deep neural network to try and train on those multiple track features. And so we train sort of a deep neural network onto the eta, the BT output, and the PT itself. And this is put into the weighted histogram, but sort of a learned weight instead of just a standard weight. And when looking at this kind of thing, we have this 3-bin convolution here. Well, we don't necessarily know that a 1-1-1 convolution is the best sort of way of finding this pattern within our histogram. Why don't we use a multivariate CNN instead and try and train that to try and find the ideal pattern within that histogram? We can do the same sort of peak finding. And then again, we can use a sort of a more complicated approach to try and do our track to vertex association. So using a deep neural network that looks at sort of the distance between the Z0 and the primary vertex, and then other track features when sort of looking at those tracks. And when sort of considering this, you can see that all of these sort of different parts could be trained individually. But overall, the thing that we care about the most is the track to vertex association, because that's the thing that we pass downstream and use to sort of actually do the physics itself. And so it would be nice if we could train a network like this that trains a weight up here that is dependent on this final result of track to vertex association. And for this reason, we combine this entire sort of 3-stage network into one end-to-end network. And so it takes sort of track features, it learns a weight function. This is part of a histogram that goes through this pattern recognition. And this is influenced by your track to vertex association probability as well. And so we have this end-to-end network that is trained on a sort of a 2-part loss function that is both trying to find a sort of an event level primary vertex reconstruction, and then also a track to vertex classification as well. Overall, it's a very small network. It's only about 1,000 parameters. So yeah, when we're putting in firmware, it's very sort of very small and lightweight. In terms of performance, it's sort of, I won't sort of talk about the core residual because overall we're sort of similar performance, but in the tails of residual we see sort of massive impact and a lot of performance gain in those tails of residual. You'll see that I've sort of got both a neural network and a quantized neural network here as well, and I'll talk a bit about sort of the quantized approach in a bit. In terms of the more important thing, the track to vertex association, we can see that we're sort of far better along this receiver operating characteristic curve. You see the sort of baseline approaches up here, but we're able to pass down sort of an overall track-to-vertex association probability downstream, which is a lot more flexible for different algorithms. So in terms of the actual firmware itself, we have to do a couple of things to make sure that our networks are nice and small. One of the things we do is something called quantization, and so this kind of restricts the bit width of your network when training. So instead of using 32-bit numbers, we use 5-bit numbers. We also use a technique called pruning. So this is iteratively removing weights as you train to try and reduce them down. And you see the impact here. So this is over 8 pruning cycles. We take sort of 1,000 parameter network down to about 100 parameter network, which means that when we sort of stick it in firmware, we go from sort of large DSP usage, which is sort of multiplications in your FPGAs, down to about 0%. So that's great for when actually using the networks in firmware. And this has a knock-on effect of reducing our latency down as well. The actual firmware generation is done by a tool called HLS4ML, but I don't really have time to go into that. So I'm afraid you can check out their paper. It's very interesting if you're into this kind of thing. The actual implementation itself is pretty standard. So we sort of take these parts of the histogram and insert them within a top-level version of the baseline vertex finding approach, and we can stick it all in this big chip. So this is just sort of showing you where these kind of different parts of the network all sort of live in firmware. So you see kind of, these big splodges sort of show you the overall sort of floor plan of where they fit in our FPGA. The only other thing to mention is that the overall latency of this algorithm, so the entire chain, is 108 nanoseconds. So we can do this inference incredibly quickly while staying within the overall size of the chip very, very nicely. So just to sort of wrap up the last bit of the talk is just to kind of link these bits together. And so I've shown sort of the track finding and the global track trigger, but we need to sort of, within CMS, we need to show that these things work together. And so we sort of tend to do sort of commissioning and testing of these various sort of bits together. And so we've looked at testing sort of these actual algorithms on the physical hardware that we use, so in the FPGAs that we actually use for the trigger. And we also need to test the communication between these subsystems. So we've individually tested both the track finder and sort of baseline versioning approach, and run sort of board-to-board tests. So this is just the actual crate which has this track finder board here, and then this vertex finding board here as well, all connected by sort of high-speed fiber optics. And so we run these kind of tests just to sort of verify that our algorithms are doing what we expect them to do. And this just kind of shows you exactly what's actually in that crate. So this is one of the boards, sort of specific boards that we use for track finding, and then this is a sort of a general purpose board that we use for vertex finding, and then other parts of the trigger as well. And this kind of shows you the firmware itself. So you can see they're kind of different chips, but the same kind of idea that we need to sort of fit them within these plans. And then that's just kind of just shows you what the actual algorithm itself is doing, but it's not hugely important. So just to sort of wrap up and give a couple of future plans. So in the track finding world, we need to sort of expand our small scale tests to actually run everything within hardware for the full chain. So we've only looked at sort of sub-chains so far. We're also looking at displaced track finding at L1. So this is quite difficult to do, but it's definitely something that we want to be able to do because it gives us sort of better handle on some things. We want to put our end-to-end neural networks in board-to-board tests. We're also looking at things like vertex quality and bigger physics studies, but this is kind of part and parcel of this algorithm testing. And then we'd also like to expand our integration tests, sort of large parts of the Level-1 trigger. And I'll sort of leave up the main sort of features of what I've shown today and ask if there's any questions. Yeah, thank you.
It's already in time, so now there is time for questions. Yeah, but plenty in the room. I don't know. I don't know who was first. Okay, you go first.
How complete is your channel filter?
How complete?
How complete in terms of noise matrix, material description? How much do you?
It's not very complete at all. So it doesn't contain much in the way of sort of. I'm not sure of the exact details, but it's very, very lightweight. So I can't remember the exact number of parameters you use. I think it might be sort of just sort of 4 or 5 within the actual correlation matrix itself, but I can't remember the exact number.
Okay, but you fully propagate a, I don't know, 5x5 matrix.
I think it's 3x3 throughout.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. I didn't quite understood at which stage you use your VDT for the track quality filtering, because you're comparing then baseline vertex finding reconstruction against new method with neural networks. But why with the reference, is your reference using the BDT that is already quite improving the chi-square?
Yes.
Against the chi-square.
Yes, it is a good point. So we haven't done sort of full studies with, well, I have, I might have a version of. So this uses the BDT cut looking at the vertex finding itself. And so we do sort of studies with just using the BDT and sort of tuning the threshold for BDT. And we see that it does improve our performance quite a lot looking at the baseline approach. But we're still able to increase our performance using this end-to-end approach as well. So we kind of look at both at the same time.
What is the, okay, like how much do you gain using an end-to-end approach against simply using in addition the BDT?
Yeah, so you probably won't be able to see the numbers, but we go sort of a root mean square about 1.6 down to sort of 0.9 with the BDT, and then we go down to a point even lower down to 0.6 with the neural network. So it's sort of another jump down in terms of performance gain.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So, I mean, this could be a dumb question. So, are you guys only reconstructing track greater than 2 GeV?
Yes.
Okay. Because I presume pileup is not really the job of the L1.
This is for the trigger.
Yeah, it's true. So yeah, it's 2G. There's yeah. I mean, we've done studies into what is the minimum PT cut that we can kind of use and maintain physics performance, and 2GB was chosen as that.
Could you elaborate a bit on the fakes at high PT? Because I would have expected it to have the opposite behavior, where you are more dominated by low PT.
So there's probably a plot I can show, which is the useful one. So I have to go with that. So this one, yeah. So this is perhaps a little bit misleading. So this just shows you the fraction of non-genuine tracks across PT. But the number of tracks we see at low PT, so we basically see a sort of a flat distribution in fakes across PT. So that the actual number of fakes across PT is flat, but we see far more tracks at low PT. But also sort of there's also sort of other things to consider, just the nature of the detector itself and sort of how we do our the track fit. And you sort of end up with this kind of this relatively large fraction of high PT fakes, or fake of tracks that are high PT are fake.
Sorry, now add a question to this. Might that be, is that after the track fit?
Yes.
So might that be a remnant of having, let's say, a strip of carbon filter without material and with not full parameterization that might cause you the flat perspective.
I think that's
in the fakes.
Yeah.
Okay, there was some.
It was already something.
So
my question is related, and maybe I misunderstood something. But if you have this very large fraction, or not large, but I mean it's a not ignorable fraction of fakes, how do you deal with that in the actual vertex reconstruction? Because these should presumably have your best track pointing resolution and thus would degrade your vertex resolution by some amount.
Yes, so this is why we see quite long tails within our vertex residuals when we use our baseline approach. And so this is one of the reasons why we do more complicated approaches to vertex findings. We want to try and reduce down the impact of these kind of fake tracks.
Yeah, I asked because we have similar problems just trying to do vertex reconstruction with 5 layers in the SPH experiment. And so we just scrapped the idea completely because we could not get a handle on those tails. So it would be interesting to see how you in the future will be able to get a handle on those tails.
Yeah.
Another question?
Just a clarification on your slide 37, you showed the floor plan on this BGA. Is it only for the network or it's the full firmware?
Yeah, so the sort of the dark, I mean, I guess the very highlighted regions of the network itself, but this extra blue here, that's other parts of the prime vertex chain. So there's this sort of histogram approach, the histogram part, the argmax part, and then the track feature transformation is all done as well, but I haven't highlighted it specifically.
But okay, but it's not the full firmware implementation because otherwise your FPGA is quite empty now.
Yeah, well, so this is just a peculiarity or a specificity of the way in which we're implementing the system. But the FPGA, we actually run a 3 times time multiplexing on this specific algorithm board. So you'd have this, but replicated 3 times.
Okay, last question.
Short one. It might be a really dumb question. Do you have at this level the information from the timing layer as well? Can you add it to it, or is it comes later?
So not in this specific part. We don't have access to that information.
Just too early, and you will have a chance to do it.
I'm not sure exactly what the plan is with that, but I don't believe it's going to be past the level 1 trigger.
Okay, so let's thanks Chris again.